She was Hannah Montana. Then she was the girl on the wrecking ball. Then she was the wild child who shocked the world at the VMAs. Then she was the woman who lost everything in a fire and rebuilt herself from the ashes. Miley Cyrus has lived more lives in 33 years than most people live in a lifetime. She has been America's sweetheart and America's nightmare, sometimes in the same week. But through every transformation, every scandal, every reinvention, she has never apologized for who she is till today. Because today, sitting across from Sunny Hostin at The View, she was about to face something she hadn't expected. Not judgment about her past, not questions about her controversies, but a systematic dismantling of everything she thought she had overcome. And for the first time in her career, the woman who never backed down was going to show the world what happens when the butterfly gets pinned to the wall. Subscribe and drop a comment below because what happens next will make you see Miley Cyrus in a way you never have before. The View studio had seen countless celebrities walk through its doors. But there was always something different when Miley Cyrus arrived. An electricity and unpredictability, the sense that anything could happen and probably would. At 33 years old, Miley had entered what critics were calling her mature era. The Grammy wins for Flowers had silenced decades of doubters who had dismissed her as a Disney product with limited talent. The stripped-down performances had revealed a voice that could stand alongside the greatest singers of her generation. She had, against all odds, become respectable. She walked onto the set, her signature raspy voice calling out greetings to the audience before she even reached her chair. The applause was genuine and sustained. These were people who had grown up with her, who had watched her transform from child star to provocateur to artist. They had opinions about Miley Cyrus, but they also had affection. "Miley, welcome back to The View," Whoopi Goldberg said warmly as the applause died down. "Congratulations on everything. The Grammys, the album, all of it. You've had quite a year." "Thank you, Whoopi. It's been wild. I mean, everything in my life has been wild, but this kind of wild I can handle." She grinned, settling into her chair with the comfort of someone who had done thousands of interviews and feared none of them. Joy Behar jumped in with some questions about the new music, about her creative process, about working with her godmother Dolly Parton on recent projects. Miley answered with characteristic honesty and humor, sharing stories about late-night recording sessions and the challenge of living up to Dolly's legacy while creating her own. It was Sunny Hostin who had been notably quiet during these opening minutes. The former federal prosecutor sat with perfect posture, her expression pleasant but unreadable, her pen tapping against her notes in a rhythm that suggested she was waiting for something. "Preparing for something, Miley, I want to ask you about something," Sunny finally said, and there was a shift in the atmosphere that the other hosts immediately registered. "You've talked a lot about your various transformations over the years from Hannah Montana to the Bangerz era to where you are now, but I'm curious about something. How much of those transformations were genuine evolution? And how much were calculated career moves designed to generate attention?" The question wasn't hostile exactly, but it carried a prosecutorial precision that felt different from the usual interview fare. Miley's smile remained, but something flickered behind her eyes. "I think all growth involves some calculation. You have to think about who you want to be, and then work toward becoming that person. But the transformations themselves were real. They came from real places inside me." "Real places," Sunny repeated, her tone suggesting skepticism. "So, the VMA's performance with Robin Thicke, the foam finger, the twerking, that came from a real place, that wasn't just shock value designed to distance yourself from your Disney image." "It was both," Miley said, her voice taking on a slight edge. "I was genuinely trying to break free from an image that was suffocating me. And yes, I knew it would get attention. Those things aren't mutually exclusive, but you have to admit there's something troubling about how you went about it." Sunny continued, leaning forward slightly. "You adopted elements of Black culture, hip-hop aesthetics, twerking, the whole urban persona to rebel against your wholesome image. And then when you were done rebelling, you dropped all of that and went back to being a rock star. Some people found that appropriative." The accusation landed hard. Miley's expression shifted from surprised to defensive to something more complex. "I've addressed this before, Sunny, multiple times. I was young. I was exploring different kinds of music and expression. I've acknowledged that I could have been more thoughtful about how I did that. But I don't think it's fair to reduce that entire period to appropriation when I was genuinely trying to make music with artists I admired. Artists you admired until you didn't need them anymore, Sunny pressed. Because once the shock value wore off, you moved on to your Malibu era, your country era, your rock era. Each transformation seems to coincide perfectly with whatever will generate the most buzz at that particular moment. Sarah Haynes looked uncomfortable. Sunny, I think artists evolve naturally over time. I'm just asking questions, Sunny replied without looking at Sarah. Miley is known for being honest, so I'm asking her to be honest about this. Were the transformations genuine, or were they strategic? Miley took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter, but steadier. You want me to admit that I'm calculating? Fine, I'm calculating. I think about my career. I think about my image. I think about what I want to say and how I want to say it. But that doesn't mean the emotions behind it aren't real. That doesn't mean the pain and the growth and the searching aren't real. What pain? Sunny asked. And there was something almost clinical in her tone because from where most people sit, you've had an incredibly privileged life. You were born into a famous family. You got your Disney show when you were 11 years old. You've never had a struggle for anything. The accusation of privilege seemed to strike something deep in Miley. Her jaw tightened visibly. Never struggled for anything. You want to talk about Sunny? Let's talk about struggle. Her voice was rising now, the raspy quality becoming more pronounced as emotion took over. Let's talk about being a child star who had to work 14-hour days while other kids were playing with their friends. Let's talk about having your entire childhood documented and judged by millions of strangers. Let's talk about becoming a commodity before you're old enough to understand what that means. She leaned forward in her chair. I was Hannah Montana. Do you know what that means? It means I was a product, a franchise, a brand. I had lunchboxes with my face on them before I had my first kiss. I had dolls made of me before I understood who I actually was. My identity was owned by a corporation. She took a shaky breath. And my own father was part of that machine. I love my dad. I always will. But he was also my co-star, my manager's client, someone whose career was intertwined with my success. Do you know how complicated that is for a child? To never know if your parent is hugging you because they love you, or because you just booked a big deal to watch your family's finances rise and fall based on your popularity. Her voice cracked. I'm not saying my dad didn't love me. He does. But the business got into everything. It infected relationships that should have been pure. It turned family dinners into production meetings. It made me question every interaction, every compliment, every moment of affection. The studio was getting quieter now as Miley's voice filled the space. So I rebelled. I did things that shocked people because I needed to prove to myself that I existed outside of that character, that I was a real person with real feelings and real autonomy and real choices. If that looks like calculation to you, then you've never had your entire identity stolen from you before you're old enough to drive. Sunny didn't back down. I understand that child stardom has its challenges, but you were compensated extremely well for that work. You became wealthy beyond most people's dreams. Doesn't that privilege come with some responsibility to handle your public transformations more thoughtfully? Responsibility? Miley laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to talk about responsibility? I was responsible for an entire production. Hundreds of jobs depended on me showing up and being perfect every single day. I was responsible for maintaining an image that would sell merchandise and concert tickets and movie deals. I was responsible for being a role model to millions of children when I was still a child myself. Her voice cracked slightly. Do you know what happens when a kid is given that much responsibility? They break. They find ways to cope. Some kids turn to drugs. Some kids disappear. I chose to break publicly, loudly, in a way that I controlled. Because if I was going to fall apart, I was going to do it on my own terms. Sunny's expression remained impassive. But did you consider the impact on the young fans who looked up to you? The parents who had to explain to their children why Hannah Montana was suddenly doing explicit performances and smoking marijuana on camera. Those parents should have been parenting their own children instead of expecting a teenager to do it for them. Miley shot back. I never signed up to raise anyone's kids. I signed up to play a character on a TV show. The fact that people confuse me with that character is their problem, not mine. That's a very convenient way to avoid accountability, Sunny replied coolly. You benefited enormously from children's devotion to Hannah Montana. But when it came time to consider those children's well-being, suddenly it wasn't your responsibility. Miley stood up abruptly, and the movement caused a ripple of tension through the studio. You want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about accountability. She began pacing, her energy too intense to remain seated. I have been accountable for every choice I've ever made. I've done interviews where I've explained my thinking, acknowledged my mistakes, talked about what I've learned. I've been more transparent about my struggles than almost any celebrity in history, and it's still not enough for people like you. She pointed at Sunny, her voice rising. You sit there with your law degree and your prosecutor's tone, asking questions designed to make me look bad. But what are you actually trying to accomplish? Do you want me to apologize for surviving my childhood? Do you want me to apologize for not having a mental breakdown in private like a good little girl? I want you to acknowledge that your choices have consequences beyond yourself, Sunny replied, her composure unshaken. That's what adults do. Adults? Miley's laugh was bitter. I've been working as an adult since I was 11 years old. I've been paying taxes, supporting my family, making decisions that affected hundreds of people's livelihoods since I was a child. Don't you dare lecture me about what adults do. She stopped pacing and faced Sunny directly. You know what I've learned about accountability in my 33 years? Real accountability isn't about satisfying your critics. It's about being honest with yourself about who you are and who you want to be. It's about making amends where you can and forgiving yourself where you can't. It's about getting up every day and trying to be better than you were yesterday. Her voice dropped, becoming more personal. I've been in therapy for years. I've worked through my issues with addiction, with identity, with the trauma of growing up in public. I've built genuine relationships with people who knew me before I was famous and who will know me after. That's my accountability. That's my growth. And I don't need your approval to validate it. Sunny remained unmoved. That's beautiful rhetoric, Miley. But let me ask you this. Your recent success, the Grammys, the critical acclaim, isn't that also a transformation? The wild child becomes the serious artist. And isn't that transformation also perfectly timed to what audiences want to see right now? The questions seemed designed to trap her, to make any answer look like a confession of manipulation. Yes, Miley said quietly. It is a transformation, and yes, it aligns with what audiences want to see. But you know why? Because I finally became the person I was always supposed to be. The timing isn't manipulation, it's healing. I spent years running for myself, and I finally stopped running. She sat back down, but her energy remained coiled and intense. You want to know the real story? Here's the real story. I lost my house in the Malibu fire. Everything I owned, all my awards, all my memorabilia, everything that connected me to my past. And instead of feeling devastated, I felt free because I realized that none of those things were me. I was still here, still standing, still capable of making music and connecting with people and building a life. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. That fire burned away everything I thought I needed to be Miley Cyrus. And what was left was just me, a person, not a brand, not a transformation, not a calculation, just a woman who had survived her childhood and her fame and her mistakes and was still here, still trying, still fighting. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. And then my marriage ended publicly, painfully. Everyone had opinions. Everyone knew whose fault it was. Everyone had something to say about Miley Cyrus's failed relationship, but none of them knew what happened inside her house. None of them knew the compromises I made, the person I tried to become for someone else, the parts of myself I buried because I thought that's what love required. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. So I wrote Flowers not as a calculation, not as revenge, as survival. I wrote it because I needed to remind myself that I could love myself even when someone else stopped loving me, that I didn't need anyone's approval or affection to be whole. And somehow that song connected with millions of people who needed to hear the same thing. That's not manipulation, Sunny. That's just being honest at the exact moment other people needed that honesty, too. She looked at Sunny with something approaching pity. You've been trying to prove that I'm fake this whole interview, that my transformations are calculated, that my growth isn't genuine. But what you don't understand is that the calculation and the genuineness aren't opposites. I can think strategically about my career and be emotionally authentic. I can plan my image and still feel real feelings. Those things coexist in everyone who's ever been successful at anything. Sunny opened her mouth to respond. But Miley held up a hand. I'm not finished. You came at me today with your prosecutorial questions and your skeptical tone, trying to make me look like a fraud. But you know what? You've actually revealed your own inability to believe that people can change. Your own cynicism about transformation. Your own assumption that success must be manipulative. She stood up again, this time with finality. I want to say something to everyone watching this. Not to Sunny, to you. The people who grew up with me, the people who watched me fall apart and put myself back together. The people who are maybe going through their own transformations right now. Her voice strengthened. You don't have to apologize for changing. You don't have to justify your growth to people who've already decided you're fake. You don't have to remain the person you were just because that's who other people expect you to be. Change is not betrayal. Growth is not manipulation, and anyone who tries to make you feel bad for becoming a better version of yourself is revealing their own limitations, not yours. She looked at Sunny one final time. Dolly Parton once told me something I'll never forget. She said, "Find out who you are and do it on purpose." That's what I've been doing my whole life. Finding out who I am. Sometimes loudly, sometimes controversially, sometimes in ways that made people uncomfortable. But always honestly, always purposefully, always as myself. She straightened her vintage t-shirt with the same gesture she'd probably made 1,000 times on 1,000 stages. Thank you for having me on the show. I'm sorry we couldn't have a real conversation about music or growth or healing. Instead, we had an interrogation. That's on you, Sunny, not me. And with that, Miley Cyrus walked off the set of The View, leaving behind a studio that felt like it was still processing what had just happened. Sunny Hostin sat in silence for a moment, her prosecutorial composure finally showing cracks. She had come prepared to expose a calculated pop star and instead had encountered something more complex. A woman who had survived things that no amount of money could compensate for. A human being who had found her way through a childhood that would have destroyed most people. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the aftermath. Whoopi shaking her head slowly. Joy looking like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Sarah wiping her eyes. And Sunny sitting alone with her notes, looking like someone who had won the battle but wasn't sure anymore what the war had been about. Sunny Host would face criticism for her approach, questions about whether her prosecutorial style was appropriate for celebrity interviews, discussions about whether her skepticism had crossed into cruelty. She would defend herself, saying she was just asking hard questions, but the clip of Miley walking off would speak louder than any defense. Dolly Parton, Miley's godmother, would post a simple message that would be shared millions of times. That's my goddaughter. She's been through more than most people will ever understand, and she's still standing, still singing, still being exactly who she is. I couldn't be prouder. And Miley herself would continue doing what she had always done. Making music, being honest, transforming. Not because it was strategic, though it sometimes was. Not because it was calculated, though she was smart enough to think ahead, but because that's what survival looked like for someone who had been a product before she was a person. That was the real Miley Cyrus, not Hannah Montana, not the wild child, not the controversial provocateur, just a woman who had spent her entire life finding out who she was and doing it on purpose, loudly, unapologetically, authentically. What do you think about this incredible confrontation? Was Sunny Host out of line, or was she just doing her job? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that will absolutely leave you speechless.